Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the third Leverhulme lecture and Distinguished Experts Dialogue on the global economy, sustainable development, and international law. My name is Freedom Kai Phillips, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and Operations Director for the CISDL. It has been my privilege to assist in coordinating this lecture as it explores an array of issues which face humanity and the complex interconnectedness of the role of international law in helping to craft solutions. This area of intellectual exploration aligns directly with my doctoral research, which focuses on the role of market mechanisms in advancing climate change and biodiversity governance.
Welcome to this evening's Leverhulme lecture and Distinguished Experts Dialogue. My name is Blessing Ajayi, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in Sustainability Management at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and a CISDL Associate Fellow. I have been privileged to be a part of the planning for tonight's lecture, as it is strongly aligned with my area of research, which focuses on sustainable development related provisions in trade agreements. Freedom and I will be your online moderators this evening.
We have the pleasure to introduce welcoming remarks by our Vice Chancellor, Professor Stephen Toop, who previously served as President and Vice Chancellor of the University of British Columbia and Director of the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. Then joining as the 346th Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, capping an already distinguished career. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice Chancellor, Professor Stephen Toop.
We can't hear the speaker.
Please pardon the error. There is a technical issue.
Experts Dialogue on the global economy, the Sustainable Development Goals, and international law. This is the third event in a series of public international Leverhulme lectures. They focused on the role of international law and governance in advancing implementation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, with a view towards combating today's most pressing threats to human and natural systems. I'm delighted to welcome and recognize the diverse audience of students and scholars, practitioners, and experts from across the legal community joining us remotely. I'm especially glad to welcome those who may not have been able to attend under normal circumstances. We're grateful to the Leverhulme Trust for the generous award that makes this vital and dynamic program possible. Special gratitude and welcome goes out to the University of East Anglia and Oxford University Press, our co-hosts, and to the renowned experts and leaders who've agreed to join us for the dialogue this evening. As global vaccine distribution continues in earnest, we have some reasons to be increasingly hopeful. Even though COVID-19 remains relentless and suffering is disproportionately severe in regions with vulnerable healthcare systems, the international community is laying the foundations for a post-pandemic economic recovery. As today's lecture and dialogue will suggest, this critical juncture has given the global community a moment to reflect. Reflect on how it might recraft international trade and investment rules and incentives, so that environmental and social priorities are more fully built into economic development decision-making, and so that our global sustainable development goals can be more consistently advanced. To reflect on how world leaders, sustained by research and education at world-leading universities, can identify innovative legal and policy approaches to ensure that economic law supports efforts to build back better, or more, to build forward towards sustainability. As I've proposed through a theory of interactional international law, solutions of this sort are based on nurturing shared understandings among relevant actors in order to build legitimacy in law. Such shared understandings are the foundation of effective and transformative dialogues across legal specialties and disciplines, and indeed, including disciplines closely connected to law. Events like this one provide an invaluable platform for the exchange of ideas and integration of perspectives. We need that exchange to build and rebuild a global economy that is resilient. We need that integration to rebuild a global economy that advances human rights, protects our fragile shared environment, and fosters more sustainable development for our community. This Leverhulme lecture is drawn from Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger's new volume published by Oxford University Press. It's called Athena's Treaties, Crafting Trade and Investment Accords for Sustainable Development, and I was delighted to contribute the preface. The volume is a substantial contribution to scholarship in our field, and I enthusiastically recommend it as a supplement to this evening's discourse. While the challenges discussed in the course of the lectures are daunting, both in their scope and in their urgency, I'm encouraged by the long and distinguished record of University of Cambridge students and researchers helping to reform international law. I have full confidence that our present community of practice will be able to lead the charge in building a better world for future generations. Thank you once again for your participation.
We would like to warmly thank the Vice Chancellor, Stephen Toope, for his inspiring and welcoming remarks on behalf of the University of Cambridge. And it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas Cochier as our chair for this evening. As former Managing Director of the World Trade Institute, a WTO panelist, and is now Professor Emeritus of European and International Law at the University of Bern, he has served as both chair on several GATT and WTO panels, and currently serves as one of the 10 arbiters for the multi-party interim appeal arbitration agreement. It is my pleasure tonight to hand over the floor to Professor Thomas Cochier, our chair.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to chair this session, and it is an even greater pleasure to welcome all the participants online. And I would like particularly to welcome our new DG at the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonya-Iweala, the speakers of today, and the invited experts, as well as the special guests, and all those listening in to this event. I'm very pleased to give the floor now to Blessing Ajayi, who is a compatriot of the DG, to introduce her before we are going to listen to her message. Blessing, please.
Thank you. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the Director General of the World Trade Organization, the first woman and first African to hold the position in the 75-year history of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization. She's an economist and international development expert with over 40 years of experience. She was chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance between 2016 and 2020, and co-chair of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala was appointed as an African Union COVID-19 Special Envoy, as well as WHO COVID-19 Special Envoy in 2020. She was one of the founders of the COVAX facility designed to get affordable vaccines to low and middle income countries. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala served as Nigeria's first female and longest serving finance minister for 7 years. She was also the first female foreign minister, and she spent a 25-year career at the World Bank, rising to the #2 position of Managing Director of Operations. In 2020, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala was named Forbes African of the Year. She is a recipient of 15 honorary doctorate degrees, including from some of the world's most prestigious universities. She holds a bachelor's in economics from Harvard University and a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, Director General Okonjo-Iweala.
Well, thank you so much, Blessing, for that generous introduction. And let me right off the bat congratulate Professor Marie-Claire Seger for her new book. I very much look forward to reading it. It's an honor to address you and all the participants today for this prestigious Leverhulme lecture and distinguished experts dialogue. It feels good to be back at Cambridge, even if symbolically. I remember that I applied for and was admitted to New Hall College in 1973, but never took up the offer, choosing to go to Harvard University instead for my undergraduate. But I still look forward to wandering the halls of Cambridge one of these days. When I campaigned for WTO Director General, I did so on the promise to bring a fresh pair of eyes and ears to the organization. Many of you have in your own writing on law and economics put forward ideas for updating and revitalizing the multilateral trading system. I'm grateful for your contributions because ideas matter in trade policy as elsewhere. As all of you know, the GATT's transformation into the WTO owes an enormous intellectual debt to the work of the late John Jackson. Ideas will continue to matter for the trading system's evolution. The WTO's core mission remains as relevant as ever, using trade as a means to enhance living standards, create jobs, and support sustainable development. The WTO is about people. It's about using trade to make people's lives better. But while the WTO's basic purpose remains the same, we face challenges that were not high on policymakers' priority lists when the Uruguay round was concluded. Climate change had been identified as a danger, but was not yet understood as an existential threat to our lives, livelihoods, and social stability and the natural environment. Biodiversity loss had not accelerated to the pace we see today. And while infectious disease has been a scourge throughout human history, we had perhaps forgotten about the potential for a respiratory virus to become a global pandemic, devastating economies and demanding global solutions. Trade policies have to be updated to respond to these and other new realities. You are part of the conversation among governments, civil society, and the private sector about how to craft appropriate responses. New concerns, along with growing skepticism about trade in some advanced economies, have perhaps overshadowed how trade and the WTO contributed to sustainable development in the 3 decades before the pandemic. I will devote the rest of my remarks to making 4 points. First, the WTO has made people's lives better, though many have not shared adequately in the benefits. Second, the pandemic is undoing years of progress on development and poverty reduction. Third, cooperation on trade is necessary to contain the pandemic and reverse economic divergence and social exclusion. And finally, new approaches to trade rules will help foster sustainable development, but they are no substitute for action, including at the domestic level. Global trade, underpinned by the multilateral rules framework, has made economies more productive. It has done so by enabling increased competition and the gains from specialization and scale that have come with a wider if still not truly global division of labor. Trade has expanded consumer choice and lowered prices, improving purchasing power. It has accelerated important aspects of sustainable development in reducing costs for green energy technologies and contributed to greater efficiency in resource use. For developing countries in particular, predictably open world markets have been a major factor in rapid growth and job creation. Countries with relatively small or poor home markets have been able to use the demand from other countries to shift people and resources out of subsistence activities and into more productive work in tradable sectors. This prosperity-enhancing shift was possible because businesses and investors could be reasonably confident that export markets were not going to slam shut unexpectedly. To borrow a phrase from the Nobel Economics laureate Michael Spence, trade helped drive faster catch-up growth in developing countries by allowing them to import what the rest of the world knows and export what it wants. Faster growth led to remarkable improvements in human well-being. In 1980, close to 40% of the world population lived on less than the equivalent of $1.90 a day. By 2019, it was less than 10%. Trade helped lift 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. This momentum made it possible for the Sustainable Development Goals to target the elimination of extreme poverty and hunger by 2030. Trade has also benefited advanced economies. Trade lowers the price of the household consumption basket for low-income families, with one estimate suggesting by as much as 2/3. The ability to source inputs from around the world help businesses compete at home and internationally. We must acknowledge that not everyone shared in the gains of recent decades. Many developing and least developed countries, especially on my continent, Africa, remain marginal players in global supply chains. Even in advanced economies, some workers and communities were hurt by import competition. These negative effects were in many cases sizable and long-lasting, especially when unaccompanied by government policies to correct market failures through active labor market policies and the crafting of social safety nets. Nevertheless, if we look at the quarter century leading up to the pandemic, a period that mostly coincides with the WTO's first 25 years, it was faster growth in developing countries, not a slowdown in rich ones, that began to narrow the gap in living standards between rich and poor countries for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. This trend was starting to falter even before the pandemic, amid rising trade tensions and protectionist measures. Today, the evidence increasingly suggests that divergence has returned. Countries' economic prospects are bifurcating based on inequalities in vaccine access and differences in fiscal capacity to provide economic relief and stimulus. Most advanced economies and China are moving ahead, whilst most emerging markets and developing economies are lagging behind. You can call it a K-shaped recovery if you want. The World Bank now expects 90% of advanced economies to regain pre-pandemic per capita income levels by next year, but only 1/3 of emerging markets and developing economies are on track to do so. The IMF projects that sub-Saharan Africa's economy will grow by 3.4% this year, much more slowly than the 6% global average. 100 million people have fallen into extreme poverty, most of them in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Economic divergence is visible in our trade data as well, with Asia, North America, and Europe on track for much stronger trade rebounds than Africa and Latin America. If this trend continues, large parts of the developing world risk social and political upheaval that could plunge countries into a downward spiral of debt distress, reduced investment and production, reduced trade and economic underperformance that fuels further unrest. To jumpstart economic growth and restore the convergence trend, we need vaccine equity. The present inequalities in access, where Africa, for instance, has received 3.1 doses per 100 people, compared to 71 doses per 100 in developed countries are unacceptable. Trade is indispensable for ramping up the production of COVID-19 vaccines on the scale needed to end the pandemic. Key vaccines rely on complex international supply chains. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, for example, relies on inputs from 12 countries, a number that rises to over 15 for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and 19 for Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. I have been urging WTO members to take action across 4 areas. 1, free up vaccine supply chains by lowering export restrictions and facilitating trade. 2, work with manufacturers to identify supply chain bottlenecks and ramp up investment in increased production. And 3, find pragmatic solutions to issues around technology transfer, know-how, and intellectual property to assure developing countries near automaticity of vaccine access while still incentivizing research and innovation. Investing in a more diversified global vaccine manufacturing base with regional hubs in Africa and Latin America will be critical for future supply resilience. We have seen firsthand the risks of a world in which 10 countries account for over 80% of all vaccine exports. Turning to the wider economy, keeping international markets open would help slow growth economies tap into faster recoveries elsewhere, which could help return them to a path towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. It would also minimize the effects of the supply shortages, logistics bottlenecks, and price spikes we are currently seeing, all of which would be aggravated if businesses and households were compelled to replace all imports with domestic alternatives. Some supply chain reshoring is bound to happen, but this is no panacea for resilience. Domestic supply chains can also be vulnerable to localized natural disasters or disease outbreaks. Improved resilience comes from better diversification and improved knowledge of supply chain vulnerabilities. WTO members have an opportunity this year to reinvigorate the WTO and enhance the predictability it provides to global trade by delivering results between now and our 12th ministerial conference in December. Decisions on fostering inclusion through assistance to micro, medium, and small enterprises and women to enter national, regional, and global supply chains would go a long way towards making trade and WTO rules work better for those who are marginalized. In this regard, the digital economy and e-commerce could help harness the potential of trade to enhance living standards. But creating new market opportunities for marginalized groups and businesses cannot replace domestic, social, educational, labor, and macroeconomic policies designed to cushion the blow of trade and automation and help workers take advantage of economic change. Differences in countries' domestic policies have been a key determinant of how broadly the gains from trade are shared. The WTO can also contribute to the SDGs, in particular SDG 14.6, on preserving the biodiversity and sustainability of our oceans and fisheries by successfully concluding the fisheries subsidies negotiations this year. I've said that 20 years is enough. If we're serious about sustainability of our oceans and our fisheries and the livelihoods of our fishermen and women, we shouldn't need 20 years to negotiate the deal. So I'm hoping we will get it done this year and contribute to sustainability. It is possible that the prospect of hard, enforceable legal commitments at the WTO makes members overly wary of discussing trade-related issues where our understanding is still evolving. One idea that might be worth exploring for other sustainability issues like climate change and plastics pollution is the economist Jean Tirol's notion of regulatory sandboxes, where new approaches can be tried out and there's scope for learning by doing. Soft law provisions could conceivably set out principles, goals, and directions, or possibly voluntary or temporary commitments. These could serve to encourage good practice and establish common measuring sticks. Friends, distinguished participants, I've made the case that trade and the WTO are key in solving today's problems and delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. My hope and expectation is that in the coming days and months, we shall continue to reinvigorate, rebrand, and reform the WTO, including strengthening its core monitoring, negotiation, and dispute settlement functions. This will enable the WTO to live up to its purpose of a people-centered trade. Thank you very much, and I wish you well in your discussions.
Thank you very much, Director General, for your very rich allocation. You recalled the importance of freer trade to create welfare, but you also recalled the importance to have the necessary safety nets. And I think you introduced the recurring theme of this evening, which is linking and connecting the dots of different fields. We all have been working in epistemic communities, and we are so pleased that with you, the horizon at the WTO is widening to be more inclusive in our efforts to tackle all these challenges you were talking about. So thank you very much, and we wish you all the best in the work towards the ministerial meeting and achieving your goals. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm now very pleased to give the floor to our co-host, Professor Diane Cole from the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. I will be very brief with the introduction, but I read with great interest that she essentially works on the question how societies reach decisions about the use and allocation of economic resources. So she may have a look from an economics point of view, and I'm pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to add my welcome to everybody who's taking part this evening. It's wonderful to see so many people engaged in this discussion. It's my great pleasure and honour to introduce Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Sega's lecture. We've been delighted to host her at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy here at the University of Cambridge as our Leverhulme Trust visiting professor. And I know that we, along with many other colleagues across the university, have benefited greatly from her insights. I'm an economist, Marie-Claire is a lawyer. The Bennett Institute is a relatively new interdisciplinary institute, and our research on the wealth economy approach to sustainability has been so enriched by Professor Cordonnier-Sega's perspective. And I hope you'll take a look at our website for more on that when you get a chance later. Professor Cordonnier-Sega has such an impressive list of achievements. She also serves as Senior Director of the Centre for International Sustainable Development Law, Executive Secretary of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, full Professor of Law at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She's editor of the Cambridge University Press series on implementing treaties on sustainable development. And in her many publications, she has been investigating the intersection of law, policy, and governance related to climate change, biodiversity, economic development, and sustainability, with that focus on global justice and the interests of future generations that is at the heart of sustainability. So we're absolutely thrilled about her new book, which is being launched tonight, Athena's Treaties, Crafting Trade and Investment Accords for Sustainable Development, which explores how trade and investment agreements could promote more sustainable development. And that is exactly the point for me to stop and hand over to Professor Cordonnier-Sega for her lecture. Marie-Claire, over to you.
Thank you and good evening. It is an honor and a pleasure to provide this lecture and launch this book, with special thanks, of course, to Diane, to Thomas for chairing the event, to our Vice Chancellor, and to a personal inspiration, the Director General, as well as to our hosts and the Leverhulme Trust Award, which makes these lectures possible. Further, I must express my deepest gratitude to our partners, including the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, the CISDL, Synergy, and SEED, as well as Oxford University Press, and especially a welcome and thanks to our extremely distinguished and knowledgeable experts and guests here online with us, who have generously agreed to join us in what I consider the main event, the Distinguished Experts Dialogue. Finally, I will warmly recognize our graduate student research teams in Cambridge and in Canada, whose insights and support and contributions have been invaluable. As this global pandemic hopefully, finally, starts to sort of recede, and we all turn our thoughts towards what kind of global economy we seek to reopen, your creativity, commitment, and courage as our students give us all hope. Next slide, please. Before we begin, it's important to pause to remember one of our special guests who was planning to participate tonight, Justice and Professor James Crawford, a dear friend and mentor for over 20 years. He will be deeply missed. I hope that he would have been proud to see this new volume, which he helped to shape, in print. Next slide, please. This lecture within this series continues an interdisciplinary invitation in two parts. First, I will highlight the opportunity for a more sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, introducing, after nearly 20 years of research and editing, Athena's treaties, crafting trade and investment accords for sustainable development, and illuminating how international trade and investment law can contribute to achieving the world's sustainable development goals, setting our global economy on a wiser, greener, and hopefully more just pathway. Second, I will conclude with a further invitation, specially directed to our leading educational institutions, international organizations, and decision makers, including many who have joined online tonight, and to our own students, to contribute further and faster to creating the future we want. Next slide, please. As the world struggles to recover from combined challenges of a global pandemic, climate and economic hardship, international cooperation has never been more important. Forces of populism, economic nationalism, and intolerance are challenging the value of collaborative relationships across borders, eroding confidence in our rules that govern international trade and investment flows, and also their impacts. Indeed, the imperative to craft durable international accords that rise to meet the pressing economic, social, and environmental challenges of our day has never been more pressing. The current international economic system is governed by national economic authorities that regulate trade and investment flows in accordance with the principles and disciplines set out in the agreements of the WTO, the UN Commission on International Trade Law, the International Center for the Settlement of International Investment Disputes, and an increasingly complex web of hundreds of regional and bilateral trade and investment agreements among financial and other economic rules. It is a crucial responsibility with the potential to shape billions of lives and livelihoods, including in the world's most vulnerable countries, and conditioning all our efforts to build back better or build forward, as the Vice Chancellor said, in a carbon-constrained world. Next slide, please. As the COVID-19 pandemic contracts the world economy, we are seeing trade and investment flows, which grew exponentially in recent decades, falter and run dry. Simultaneously, nearly all international scientific bodies are expressing deep concern, highlighting our fragile health systems and intensifying human development pressures, and also the shattering of global planetary boundaries. Rapid and dangerous climate change is exacerbating global poverty rates, undermining access to essential crops and food sources, and threatening the livelihoods for millions. Even as our planet's ecosystems, including the forests, grasslands, and wetlands, rivers, and oceans, also the migratory species which depend on them, continue to degrade, with nearly 1 million species facing extinction in the next few decades. Successive waves of the COVID-19 pandemic reaching over 176 million cases and more than 3.8 million deaths worldwide this month, risk a global economic contraction of over 5.2% or more, further escalating global poverty. As scientific knowledge advances and the complex interdependence of human, natural, and economic systems become better understood, the challenges for sound law and policy and for justice increase exponentially on all levels. Taking scientific warnings seriously, we cannot simply push these problems forward yet again. As we walk into the 2021 and the future, our world is facing a crossroads. Next slide, please. Further, and of special importance this evening, our global economy, including the trade and investment liberalization projects that we have pursued, have not always contributed to solving these crucial problems. Indeed, concerns have been raised across scientific, legal, economics, and other disciplines, as the Director General highlighted, that certain increases and certain patterns of trade and investment may have even actually exacerbated increasing poverty, climate change, and other dangerous trends. Absent mitigation and enhancement measures, many studies identify patterns of negative scale, scope, and technology impacts from increases in trade and investment under certain conditions. Indeed, one analysis suggests that international trade embodies from 17 to 30% of biodiversity loss, from 15 to 38% of global problematic labor, from 62 to 64% of global metal ore extractions under questionable conditions, 70% of global coal exploitation, 23 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, the OECD has tracked global fossil fuel subsidy levels at US $577 billion in 2018, decreasing only a little in 2019. Further, and perhaps more troubling, next slide, please, in part driven by illicit international trade investment pressures, illegal, unreported, and unregulated exploitation is degrading key natural resources upon which billions of the poorest and most vulnerable people rely for water, food, shelter, and other basic needs in times of extreme hardship, especially during a health pandemic. These trends, even without the impacts of COVID-19, are not simply unfortunate coincidence. They are a form of failure of our practices, of our knowledge and education systems, and of our policies and laws on many levels. Next slide, please. These challenges are connected, complex, and increasing in severity. However, they are not truly surprises. Across the 193 UN member states, in the World Trade Organization, and in many other international organizations, efforts are being made, even with limited human, financial, and political resources, intensifying the need for prompt and effective domestic and other public policy responses, backed by legal and institutional reforms to foster rather than frustrate global sustainable development. The international community has been examining scientific data, raising the alarm, and struggling to negotiate responses through the UN and other institutions for nearly a quarter of a century. International conferences and debates have been leading slowly, at least to clearer definitions of problems, to general commitments to cooperate, and to fragmented, incoherent, conflicting, and sometimes overlapping attempts to act. And that action, as the Director General has emphasized, is crucial. Next slide, please. As this Sustainable Development Policy Progress Timeline alone indicates, we have, in our defense, all been trying. Through a series of international events and programs of action, in this case leading through from the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment to the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, which I attended as a starry-eyed student and youth leader, to the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development, where we launched the first main event on international law, and the 2012 UN Conference on Sustainable Development, as well as through the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals in 2000 and the negotiation of myriad international instruments that support sustainable development, and I count trade and investment community firmly within that group. And our stumbling, thorny path to collaboration, next slide please, has not been completely in vain. Replacing the MDGs in 2015, a new cooperation agenda toward 2030, countries have adopted 17 sustainable development goals with 169 key targets, covering key areas of public policy from poverty, hunger, education, health, and gender equality, to water, energy, employment, infrastructure, equality, cities, production and consumption patterns, climate change, biodiversity, oceans, and justice, and also establishing global partnerships for action. As an agenda for the global community, the SDGs apply to all countries, rich or poor, providing a common framework to facilitate cooperation and action. They offer a succinct set of public policy priorities and time-bound targets to unite international actors, countries, and all stakeholders. Of course, detractors underline that each SDG target is aspirational, strictly non-binding in nature. However, like other important and universal aspirations, such as world peace or human rights or fair and free trade, the Sustainable Development Goals are not legally irrelevant. Indeed, the opposite is true. Next slide, please. The research that we've been leading has shown that the Sustainable Development Goals embed responses to challenges at the global economic level and all the way across the system, global social challenges as well across the system, and global environmental challenges as well. Next slide, please. And they are supported by hundreds of binding international treaties, including the agreements of the World Trade Organization itself. As you can see from this wheel, if you look inside each of the Sustainable Development Goals, you find binding treaty commitments that countries have been promising, in some cases for decades, and in some cases quite recently. Next slide, please. In fact, efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets are supported by the principles of international law itself and by many binding international, regional, and bilateral accords. The entire network of increasingly specific international accords has been adopted in recent decades. Law and international law, backed by sound policy and institutions, and a lot more cooperation, will either help or hinder the implementation of every sustainable development goal. These binding accords set specific and enforceable obligations, along with cooperative work programs and institutions that can work together to support achievement of each SDG. In each case, an intergovernmental regime engages an epistemic community, a community of stakeholders from local to global in scope, to implement key operational requirements, often with public participation, financing, monitoring, reporting, and verification arrangements, as well as dispute settlement and other provisions. Mobilizing and scaling up action on all these channels to achieve the SDGs by 2030 could make a significant difference in response to the global challenges we face, keeping our international legal promises and laying the foundations for advances even in this time of crisis. Next slide, please. Now, what do the SDGs tell us about trade and international law? They certainly are not silent. We have commitments to promote a universal rules-based, open and non-discriminatory and equitable multilateral trading system under the WTO. We have commitments to increase the exports of developing countries, especially for least developed countries. We have commitments to realize timely implementation of duty-free and quota-free market access on a lasting basis for all least developed countries. We have commitments to encourage foreign direct investment to states where the need is greatest, in accordance with their national plans and priorities. And we can see in particular commitments on poverty, on sustainable agriculture, and on sustainable energy in this respect. And we have commitments to adopt and implement investment promotion regimes for least developed countries and others. Next slide, please. So then the question becomes, how do we go from some trade regimes which have impacts that we don't want, to more trade and investment that encourages and helps us to reopen the global economy in a way that responds to these pressing imperatives. Luckily, we're not alone in just guessing some of those ideas that the Director General has kindly called for, those ideas that matter. We have a body now of over 200 impact assessments that have been actually conducted over the last 20 years and were studied in the new book, helping us to understand what some of the most important impacts might be if we get our laws wrong. And indeed, these different impact assessments that have been carried out reveal three key tensions. Material, scale, scope, and technology, along with other impacts from new trade and investment disciplines, can be traced to deeper normative tensions. The book organizes them into three: obligations that can constrain the adoption and implementation of new regulations to meet other multilateral treaty commitments on sustainable development. It's not a carte blanche, but where there are multilateral treaty commitments that are being held, it's important to examine that tension. Tension two, pre-existing social and environmental challenges can be directly or indirectly exacerbated by growing trade and investment flows occasioned by the new treaty. And tension three, some trade and investment agreements may incentivize economic growth of an unsustainable nature, or, as the Director General have referenced with regards to subsidies on fisheries, they may make the very opposite, as we'll turn to next. Next slide, please. In order to develop the ideas in the book further, and here's where we transition to the final part of the lecture, we adopt especially an interactional international legal theory, one of legitimacy and legality. This account traces clarity, non-contradiction, constancy, congruence, and other criteria to establish a practice of legality with law as a purposive international legal enterprise that builds and maintains reciprocity through a legal framework and culture. In recent decades, yes, international trade and investment law has faced legitimacy challenges. Rules are transforming practices and constituencies, but are also being interactionally transformed on all levels and by changes in the system itself. And this is what interactional legal theory provides for. The WTO, UNCITRAL, ICSID, and others, also 335 plus free trade agreements and 2,000 or more bilateral investment treaties can and are changing interactionally as law and governance regimes themselves, contributing to global sustainable development goals through integration where appropriate. Next slide, please. In the WTO, the Director General has covered some of the main needs and also some of the major advances. Sustainable development has been recognized as an objective and is firmly embedded in the legal regime, but trade and investment law governs different scales and scopes. The devil, as everyone always says in trade law, is in the details. It remains open in the WTO what specific provisions and measures can be enacted in time to increase the contributions of trade and investment law to achieving the SDGs. What additional cooperation might be undertaken at the global level on trade-related aspects of pandemic recovery, food security, clean energy, climate change, and other priorities? Further, next slide, please. We can see a web of 339 notified regional trade agreements currently in force, 2,298 bilateral investment treaties, plus at least 324 smaller, what the Director General referred to as sandbox treaties that are currently in force around the world and governing and testing and experimenting trade and investment law for sustainable development. Next slide, please. These innovations for sustainable development are worthy of study and worthy of attention and worthy of those ideas that we have been challenged to provide. Many options do exist to address sustainability concerns, including adoption of diverse domestic, legal, economic, and policy flanking measures or safeguards to mitigate negative impacts and enhance positives. Tailored international legal measures can also be crafted within the trade and investment agreements themselves to address the most significant challenges and contribute directly to these Sustainable Development Goals. The comparative analysis of 110 plus interregional, regional, and bilateral accords in this new book shows that states are already testing in their petri dishes, in their sandboxes, diverse innovations that are worthy of study. Next slide, please. And in order to track that work, we propose a framework. The book offers some ideas. The first, and I won't read through all of the examples tonight because the slides will be available, as will the lecture, to some of those who have registered. There's the adoption of the purpose, or what in international law we call the object and the purpose. Sustainable development being recognized as an object or principle of bilateral regional economic accords, and it is doing so in many cases. Just as the WTO itself has done, states are now signaling a commitment to sustainable development in carefully worded introductory object and purpose provisions in their trade agreements. And then they're operationalizing it through 3 particular pathways. And I'm going to walk through them as part of the conclusion of this lecture. This is the thesis of the book, as it were. Next slide, please. The first is, of course, exceptions for sustainability measures. So this is where we're trying to address that first tension that was laid out earlier. And indeed, exemptions from economic disciplines where obligations might otherwise constrain sustainable development regulators in order to be able to meet their other multilaterally agreed international commitments are being found increasingly, including in the 110 regional and bilateral trade agreements that were surveyed for this research. We have general exceptions related to the conservation of natural resources modeled on the WTO provisions. We have specific exceptions in sections of the agreement where rules on phytosanitary standards or technical barriers to trade or intellectual property rights or government procurement or services or investment might constrain the use of environmental and social measures. We also see explicit non-application notes, often as footnotes to the treaty in the annexes or in the schedules of tariff provisions, which are inserted in order to prevent socially or environmentally sensitive sectors from being disciplined inappropriately. For example, keeping parks and natural resources or areas that are subject to agreements with Indigenous people from being subject to investment liberalization provisions. And we have general interpretive statements to guide potential areas where the trade rules could otherwise constrain the use of measures agreed in other international or regional agreements directly. A few examples are provided on the slide. Next. Our second pathway is more exciting in a way. It's not trying to stop trade or investment from harming sustainable development interests. It's building additional cooperation into the new Green Deal of the trade agreement. And we can see this again being experimented with across the board. We have parallel agreements or chapters for cooperation on environment, social, sustainable development, and other priorities, specific to the actual opportunity that exists between those parties in terms of their own trade and investment flows. This isn't something that would be easy to do in a general sense. It has to be done in the sandbox. Joint coordination of new institutions for social, environmental, and sustainable development cooperation that are sweetened by an offer of economic development and economic access to markets. Common work programs on specific environmental and social projects, often accompanied by capacity building, technology transfer, financial commitments. This is crucial. We identify in the impact assessments possible dangers, and we include work programs to address them, even to mitigate or flank them, or preemptively build cooperation on them. And we even see in some of these agreements, factual report, complaints, or arbitration mechanisms to provide recourse when rules appear to be violated to attract trade and investment. And we're seeing more of that recently. Next slide, please. So pathway number 3 is what I think is the most exciting one, actually. Yes, do no harm. yes, cooperate outside the treaty, but alongside it. But most exciting and most interesting, enhance the trade and investment liberalization itself in order to actually achieve growth in the economy in sustainable areas. And we see this more and more in the last 7 or 8 years of tracking. This is what the book documents with most interest. Not just TBT, SPS, or IPR provisions that actually can help us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but also creative provisions that privilege socially responsible corporations in concession contracts, or enhance liberalization of environmental goods and services, or pilot differential tariffs for sustainable products and sustainable palm oil, for example. Measures to promote Indigenous small and medium-sized enterprises, or to promote trade in Indigenous goods, or measures to reduce illegal trade in forestry products and promote trade and investment in certified sustainable wood. We see measures to secure reductions in unsustainable fisheries, and one day we may see them for fossil fuels as well, along with other subsidies. And we see measures to promote trade and investment for those concerned about zero carbon commitments in eco-innovation, in clean and renewable energy, in technologies that will help us to achieve some of our goals, and in organic agriculture of such great importance to everyone trying to survive a global pandemic. Next slide. So to look forward, we've seen already, and the last substantive part of the book documents it, that process innovations are key to the substantive provisions. And we've seen certain procedural innovations undertaken by parties that inspire or advance sustainability in trade and investment accord implementation and dispute settlement. Everything from ex ante, ongoing, or ex post, environment, sustainable development, human rights, sustainability, impact assessments and reviews that then shape those programs of cooperation, and in some cases, even those enhancement measures. Also consultations which take place more and more between economic, environment, and development authorities. And I was part of those processes myself in Canada when I worked for Canada's Ministry of Natural Resources, leading their International Affairs Department. Mechanisms to ensure transparency and public participation. We have seen a plethora of new attempts, new sandbox experimentation in this regard. Consultations, councils, forums. Perhaps the standard is set high by the World Trade Organization with its changes and new symposia and consultations and forums that are hosted. But we've seen very interesting experiments with international advisory councils and mechanisms to inform trade and investment arbitration tribunals about sustainable development issues. Everything from experts panels to fact-finding missions and consultations to receptivity to amicus curiae briefs, transparency and public participation for hearings, publication of awards, net zero or green arbitration codes and practices. And there are people here online who are leading those initiatives, and I congratulate them for it. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I want to raise one other very exciting development, and it's the last 3 chapters of the book as well. It's possible to link innovative experiments, policy and law innovations found in these new trade agreements and at the global level with each and every of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to walk you through SDG 1, 2, 5, 6, and 7 that are on the slide. The slides are going to be available to you, and so is the lecture. Next slide, please. But I will simply point out that if, as we are worrying right now here in the UK, looking forward toward the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP26, we are committed to taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. We can look already back to 2012, when the EU, Colombia, and Peru in their free trade agreement agreed to promote trade and investment measures that would facilitate access, dissemination, and use of best available technologies for clean energy production and use, and for mitigation and adaptation to climate change, recognizing the importance of cooperation in activities such as those related to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, including reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Those types of backed by a trade agreement, backed by economic development cooperation, backed by capacity building and finance and monitoring, and a new institution do hold some hope looking forward for us all. Next slide, please. Indeed, if we track them through in that same SDG wheel that I showed you beginning looking across all of international law, we find examples from trade agreements across the board for every single SDG. Next slide, please. And while I'm not going to make you walk through all of it tonight, I will point out that many of these agreements are conditioned to specific economic opportunities that exist between two countries, in one region, in a transatlantic or trans-Pacific partnership, and in some cases have been pioneered in the World Trade Organization itself. And that's the kind of new ideas that we owe those who are asking. It's our job here in academia to track, monitor, analyze, and offer this work. Next slide, please. And I will actually highlight that Blessing Ajayi, our graduate student who is our moderator tonight, is one of the individuals who is actually doing this research. And I'm looking forward to her book and her professorship when the time comes. So in terms of conclusions, states are adopting sustainable development as part of the object and purpose of regional and bilateral treaties, as well as globally. They're also experimenting innovative pathways to integrate environmental and social considerations, addressing the tensions that they're identifying in the impact assessments with new provisions and new cooperation mechanisms. The procedural innovations help. They identify what we need to address. They identify opportunities, and they make sure that there is, as the Director General mentioned, a possibility to appeal to binding dispute settlement, which has a chance of being fair. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, however. You can't just make a trade agreement, reduce poverty, secure net zero development, or promote the SDGs more broadly. But rules can and should be intentionally, interactionally crafted to enhance the contributions of economic recovery to sustainable development. Last slide. And this is where I reach our second invitation, our concluding invitation, as it were. All efforts are needed for more sustainable post-pandemic recovery. We need to strengthen awareness, education, and career skills. We need to scale up relevant research, engaging stakeholders, and ensuring impact for sustainability. When the world trade regime asks for ideas, it's our job to provide them and more, to get involved and help with the action. And we need to provide that excellent independent advice to economic law and policy decision makers at all levels, in our countries and even in our municipalities. A single decision to turn all of the transport fleet in Morocco to electric vehicles, or in the city of Marrakesh to build more charging stations, will make billions of difference. Last slide. I'll conclude with a quote from the book. The rules which facilitate trade and investment could, I'll say continue to, defend the interests of Hermes, Greek god of commerce and also thieves. Or learn to draw inspiration from Athena, goddess of justice, wisdom, and the crafts. I think the second option is the one we should be choosing. Thank you.
Professor Avidan Kemp, please.
Many thanks, Marie-Claire, for this wonderful and truly inspiring lecture. I'm always, and also with Athena on this one, absolutely. This topic is, of course, an extremely important topic, and of course, it's going to become even more important and more complex in the future. And books such as the one that you've written, of course, are going to provide us with some sort of a roadmap to help us, to guide us in those developments. On behalf of the University of East Anglia, it is a real honor to be a part of this wonderful event with you and the Bennett Institute as well. And also to have so many distinguished speakers here with us today. The University of East Anglia, for those of you who do not know us, is one of the world's leading institutions today when it comes to the research of environmental studies and of course climate change more specifically. And we do hope to keep this collaboration alive also in the future. So I'm not going to take any more from the time for the discussions later on, and I will leave the floor now to our next speakers. So thank you very much from the University of East Anglia.
Thank you very much, Professor Kent. Before we turn to our first panel, I just like to briefly also thank Marie-Claire, not only for this book, but actually the tremendous networking work she does to bring all these different fields together. On the book, I was particularly impressed when I read the manuscript to see the bottom-up approach. As a WTO lawyer, we tend to think in terms of multilateral disciplines and then trickle down into preferential trade agreements. But the real world is actually working the other way around, bottom up. And this has been the case in the 19th century with intellectual property, where the Berne and the Paris Convention were built on bilaterals. The GATT was built on bilateral trade agreements. And probably a new generation of multilateral rules will gain a lot of inspiration from the bottom-up approach and the laboratories which are documented in this most valuable book. Now, turning to our first panel, which it deals with the trade angle, and the second one will the investment angle, and the third one will deal with governance issues here. I would like to briefly introduce our three speakers, and I would invite them to open up their video. You all know Professor James Backus, who was twice the chairman of the appellate body in the WTO and is a distinguished university professor of global affairs and director of the Center of Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the University of Central Florida. James has been working for many years on the interface of trade and environment, in particular climate change. Advocate Anna Joubabre is the Secretary of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law and Director of the Division on International Trade Law in the Office of Legal Affairs of the United Nations here. Her focus is essentially on investment issues here, and we will see how she brings trade and investment together. And Ricardo Mendes Ortiz, an old friend from ICTSD, is with us, and he is the founder and fellow of the Carolyn M. Globe Sustainability and Strategic Advisor of Latin Trade Group, and may also bring in a particular Latin American angle to it. I would invite the speakers to be very brief, 3 minutes, to just kick off with their main thoughts. I would hope that they also bring in considerations of how we can use general legal principles in this process, such as sustainability, such as equity, such as what I'm interested in, an emerging principle of common concern of humankind, and how these principles can be also used to bridge these different areas which Marie-Claire alluded to in her wonderful lecture. So may I start off with James?
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's good to be with all of you today. I have written several books on the questions you just raised. I won't try to summarize all of what I said in them here. Instead, I'll confine myself to making just one point before making myself available for questions afterwards. I want to congratulate the Director General on her remarks, especially on her emphasis on the need to restore the WTO appellate body which is central to the working of the WTO dispute settlement system. And I want to applaud all that Marie-Claire has said in her presentation. She and I share many views, including the view that these changes must come from the bottom up and not be imposed from the top down. The one point I want to make is simply this at the outset, and that is that while many trade traditionalists view a consideration of trade rules in the context of sustainable development as somehow a departure from what the WTO is supposed to be, that is not true. It is not a departure from the mission of the WTO. Rather, it is the fulfillment of the original mission of the WTO. It's simply doing what we said we would do when we created the WTO back in 1994. And I always, when I was judging WTO appeals, resorted first to the text of the WTO agreement. Let me do so here just very briefly. I'm looking at the first paragraph of the preamble on the very first page of the Marrakesh Agreement, where it says that trade and economic endeavors should be conducted with a view to the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. This was a change from what the original contracting parties to the GATT had said when they established the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947. If you go back and look at what is now GATT 1994, you'll see that they sought, and I quote, the full use of the resources of the world. Now, in one of the appellate opinions that Marie-Claire cited, which my colleagues and I wrote some years back, the appellate body decided that this is a difference that makes a distinction. And the distinction is that the development of trading system should be done in a way that is consistent with sustainable development and with the economic, environmental, and social pillars of it. Marie-Claire has given us dozens of ways in which that can be done. She's given us dozens of ways in which it's already being done, and a lot of bilateral and regional agreements. Belatedly, some visionary members of the WTO are in their discussions in Geneva talking about how to bring more of these issues fully within the trading system. But in doing this, we're only doing what the treaty says we're supposed to do. This is not a radical change on our part. Those who are seeking the radical change are those who don't want to do this. And it's about time we recognize that. We have other speakers. I want to stop here for now. Thomas, I'd like to hear them. And I know we're trying to preserve as much time as possible for questions and answers. So I'll be happy to try my best to answer any questions that are asked of me.
Thank you, James, for this powerful statement, which I think is very important these days when we are struggling with the qualification of carbon tariffs and a lot of opposition invoked that this is not consistent with WTO law, etc. May I give the floor to Anna Jubin?
Thank you, Professor Cochier. And at the outset, let me congratulate Marie-Claire wholeheartedly for a wonderful publication that I'm looking forward to introducing to the Ancestral Library. UNCITRAL is one of the two legislative bodies of the United Nations. Together with the International Law Commission, the UNCITRAL Commission looks into private international law, and more particularly at the trade and business aspects of international law. And we are looking very much at international law from the grassroots level. So we are not looking at multilateral negotiations on tariffs and trade, but we are looking at the fundamental and sustainable infrastructure that is necessary for trade to take place. And I would like to focus on two SDGs that Marie-Claire, I'm very happy to say, has not identified, which are SDG 9, to which we try very hard to contribute through the work we are doing currently on digital trade. And particularly starting from the legal challenges of the digital economy, trying not to be bogged down by the technology itself, but rather taking a UNCITRAL principled technological neutrality point of view. We're looking into the disruptions that all these technologies bring to international transactions, to the international supply chain. And we, I would say, have been even more encouraged by the way we have seen the COVID-19 pandemic impacting international trade, and seeing that moving international trade into the digital sphere has been a way to answer many of the challenges. So what we are trying to unlock with the approach we are taking for digital trade and the legal instruments and model laws that we're working on in this area are also very close to what is being done currently in the WTO. And I'm very glad to see the emergence of initiatives such as the Joint Statement Initiative on digital cooperation, which is all about making sure that digital trade can work and the legal infrastructure we provide can be put to better use in international transactions. But also, and I would submit this is where the broader aspiration of the Sustainable Development Goals comes into play, is really to make sure that this digital transformation that is taking place and to which we are contributing does not leave three quarters of the human beings behind, and does not concentrate only on those that have the ability currently to develop artificial intelligence, to develop blockchain technologies, to develop data transactions, but also makes sure that this can be available to all. And let me simply flag as well another of the SDGs that is very dear to our heart in UNCITRAL. It's SDG 16.9, the one that emphasizes the right to an identity. And here the digital identity, which is being currently, where bridges are being developed between various systems of granting this digital identity through a model law that we will present to our commission shortly, seems to us to be responding also to one of the challenges of digital trade and digital cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for putting the emphasis on the transactional side of the equation. I'm pleased to give the floor to Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And at the outset, also, obviously, I have to add my congratulations to Professor Marie-Claire Seger-Cordonnier. I think she's done a fantastic job in the presentation. And I'm really that she's been doing this kind of contribution now for so many years. Pardon me?
We couldn't hear you well, but it's fine. Okay.
So I was congratulating Marie-Claire, but let me go to your question and and pick up also from where Jean Bacchus just left. So 30 years or so ago, many of us that were negotiating the WTO and some of these deals, including the Rio Principles, had the intention to ensure that there would be coherence, coordination, and hopefully enforcement of the treaties that were being negotiated. And it was in that hope that these principles of sustainable development were included. Now, Jim himself has been part of the implementation as a chair of the appellate body of the WTO years ago, and much has happened. But we have to say, as Marie-Claire just shown, that we are still in the same planet with more degradation, with the same WTO agreements that we finalized in '95 by and large, but a significant and plenty of developments in international law, including trade law. So we need to ask ourselves, what is missing? No, we need to ensure that institutional arrangements and social realizations do not hurt our ability for maintaining or improving future living standards. That's absolutely critical of sustainable development. Trade and sustainable development hinge on these institutions that we have created. And in the absence of a formal worldwide authority, we need to ensure that domestic and international institutions interact constructively to pursue sustainable development goals and not work at cross purposes. We still see a lot of this. While national governments can establish sustainability directives from ministers and ministries and so on, this is not the option available at the multilateral level. This is what we have witnessed. Global governance recognizes a system that operates under formal and informal rules and practice arising from multiple sources, and that efforts are accountable to multiple stakeholders. Getting these rules to reinforce each other and work together coherently is critical. To do this, governments will need to work still more innovatively within and across institutions and bring the intergovernmental machinery of institutions together. The challenges are manifold. Climate change impacts are complicating the picture even more. In a way, COVID has shown us what we know, which is that we're currently transiting from a world of plenty into one in which the planet's resources have been compromised in their ability to sustain our routines. With global integration, the modes and organizational production have become more complex in the life of the WTO. Growing demand is increasingly satisfied through cross-border transactions. Final product is often the result of the involvement of multiple agents in diverse jurisdictions, weaving through rapid and multifarious relations governed by a myriad of institutional arrangements. But policies driving investment, finance, energy, knowledge do not necessarily yet harness economic activity in favor of resource conservation. So several crucial sustainable development policies have ramifications for commercial exchange. Shaping and managing this intersection is, as we have seen, a critical challenge for governance. The current trading system, together with the growing landscape of bilateral and regional trade agreements that Marie-Claire referred to, is not really fully equipped to steer economic activity towards new pathways, notwithstanding that principle of sustainability that was introduced in the chapeau agreements of the Marrakesh Accords. So at the same time that the trading system must remain true to its primary aims and not allow environmental policy to become a pretext for governments to engage in perverse and welfare diminishing discriminatory practices, as we have seen in the past few years, or to pander to influential domestic economic actors, trade and investment policies continue to determine allocation and use of resources, from minerals and labor to knowledge and soil, and individual society's ability to govern domestic resources today. And this is why, again, my plea is to make sure that we focus on helping through international trade investment law to move the economics that underpin these agreements to address market failures, to think long-term, intergenerationally, longer range thinking, to internalize costs, to provide for public goods. And I finished there, Thomas, just again, with a reflection of the past 30 years, where against coherence, coordination, implementation, and particularly the role of enforcement, they are all big challenges for international law and the crafting of those agreements. And I think this is what this community should be contributing to.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I'd like to open up now the floor for to our special guest, if they would like to open up the video and ask whether they have particular questions to our panelists.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yes, Wayne Garnons-Williams, Chair, International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization. Thank you for that amazing presentation. Anna Jubin-Brett, a question. In November of 2017, Jack Ma, co-founder of Alibaba, opened the first viable digital free trade zone, as opposed to a regular free trade zone, in Malaysia, as a response to Southeast Asia's booming e-commerce sector. Is this something that is that is being monitored by your group? And is there a future for this in digital free trade zones around the globe to be a potential response to one tool for environmental sustainable trade? Thank you.
Would you like to take the question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you whether I should respond to it right now. Yes.
Yeah, we have time for about one round only of questions. We're running behind schedule already, so there won't be much time. So please do respond.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the Asian region has been spearheading digital cooperation, and a lot of the most recent provisions on digital cooperation can be found, for example, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, where there is a standalone chapter on digital cooperation and on digital trade. And what we are monitoring, of course, as Professor Cochier said, at the transactional level, is in order to put such a cooperation in place, it's absolutely necessary to have the legal infrastructure that enables you to carry out these transactions. And that's precisely what the ancestral e-commerce and now digital trade frameworks provide. And that is, of course, as I said, to be implemented through legislation at the domestic level. And when it comes to mutual recognition, of course, through provisions in free trade agreements, as is the case in the Pacific. Thank you.
Further questions from the experts? Can I ask one more question to James and Ricardo? It hasn't been raised, but we had a very strong counter movement against international cooperation with populism, not only in the United States, but across the world. And I think that is one of the major challenges here. What are the answers to be given to these movements and concerns in seeking
I'll go
to...
first and then turn to Ricardo, if I may. There's been a widespread failure in many countries, including my own, to make certain that the benefits from trade are widely shared. In my view, it is not the job of an international institution to delve so extensively into domestic policy to engage in income redistribution. I think those decisions have to be made domestically. There's much that can be done internationally, such as all that we've been talking about, to make certain that trade and investment rules work as they should to promote sustainable development, which of course includes jobs and good wages and good working conditions, productivity, and more. But I feel that too often trade has been used as the finger to point at overseas as an excuse for a failure to do what needs to be done domestically, not only in better kinds of income distribution through taxes, to be candid, but also in making certain that the people of the country, the workers of the country, the children of the country are as prepared as they need to be able to succeed through a full human flourishing in a global economy. We have not done that in the United States in the past quarter of a century, and we're paying for it now. I think the same is happening in some other countries.
Thank you, Thomas. I think that's a critical question. When I look at what has happened in the past few years, I tend to think that it looks like populism, but it may be sort of misdirected economic policies also just behind some of these politicians' claims, and then the kind of shifts that we have seen in policy, which are very worrisome. And so I think that they are fed by a less than full performance of the current trade system, if I may be critical of that. And so the trade system has, it's been lingering on issues that have to do with opportunities that people need. Just this morning, I was reminded in a conversation with economists in Latin America about how textiles and garments from many of those countries continue to face very high tariffs, including in the US market, for instance, and then some of the developed markets that are their natural markets. But there's also the question, for instance, of the delay in resolving critical issues that have to do with agricultural trade and opportunities for in many countries, particularly in those that are efficient producers of agricultural products. So, and I'm not just saying that trade has to perform on efficiency basis and sort of in a way for trade liberalization. What I'm saying is that with flanking policies for environment, for social issues, with policies that understand again the relation between the environment, for instance, and say agriculture or economic activity, we need to move from measuring yield on surface and measuring yield rather against other resources like water and again soils and so on. So if we move to smarter policies at the domestic level, we still need the trade system to deliver on its original intent. And that's something that, again, the lack of it feeds many of this economic nationalism that we see around. I'll close there saying that, I mean, Jim put the finger there, but I think it's very worrisome to see some of them developed countries now picking up on some of those policies that are really in the fringe of protectionism and taking us back some 30 years.
I agree with Ricardo.
This actually gets us into the governance question, and I think we are reminded that the issue here is one of multi-level governance, and we need to also watch what is being done at the national level and the regional local levels in promoting these goals, and so the systems can interact properly. I had a message from Professor Daniel Esty that I think we should anticipate his contribution briefly. And I would suggest that we collapse the third panel right away here with the first one, building up on the governance questions here. And essentially asked the question, how do we need to shape the governance systems and institution to facilitate post-pandemic economic recovery, and also with a view to achieve the SDGs here. I also would like to have Professor Wayne Garnons-Williams joining right away. And I would start with Dan Esty, who you probably know all. He is Professor of Environmental Law and Policy, School of the Environment, and Clinical Professor of Environmental Law and Policy at Yale Law School. Dan, can I give you the floor?
Thank you so very much. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy days and busy lives to have this conversation. And a special thanks, of course, to Marie-Claire for bringing us together with not only a wonderful lecture, but a book that I think is going to help shape thinking going forward in a number of ways. I do think we've got a fundamental challenge in front of us, and it goes to the legitimacy of the trading system. And that's been hinted at, but I want to put that issue squarely in front of us. And I do think there's an important reason to have a trading system. And frankly, for some who have called for us to, for people to pull back from trade, I don't think that's an option. International interconnections are a fact and not a choice. We see that in the pandemic, but it's also a fact in terms of economics. So the question really is, what sort of a system are we going to have? And I think the conversation today has been very helpful in framing the issues that are out there, the choices that need to be made. And in particular, I think Marie-Claire's given us some of the starting points for a reimagining of the trading system. And I do think it's fundamentally going to require that. I think the governance issues are ones that are significant. The trade system did emerge in the wake of World War II. It was remade 25 years ago as we launched the WTO, but I think it's time to remake it again. And I think it does require, as Professor Cochier has just said, more attention to the multiple levels of governance. There's a global level, but a national level that needs to be taken perhaps more seriously, and a subnational level that's been underattended to. And I think the theme of the bottom-up connecting to a more top-down structure is important. But I think our 20th century model was inattentive to that. And it was inattentive as well to questions of equity. And I think, frankly, inattentive and perhaps excessively focused on economic priorities without other values that need to be taken on board, like sustainable development. So I would offer, just in my brief time, one thought as we try to build sustainable development into this remade trade system fit for purpose in the 21st century. And that is that we need to really understand that the existing system prioritizes export trade for large players, large companies. And we need to re-gear around opportunities for workers, farmers, small businesses, and frankly, ensure that the very structure of the system does not allow the economically powerful to be the dominant force. And I think starting that process would be a shift to a new principle that there can be no externalities driven by the trading system. That's implicit in what Marie-Claire told us, but I think it should be made explicit, that we are going to have a new frame for business internationally and frankly domestically as well, that says you cannot profit privately by burdening the public or society broadly with expenses that you should bear, whether that's pollution, underpaid workers, or anything else. So I leave you with a thought that we should be focusing on an end to externalities as the starting point for the remade trading system. And for those who are interested, I have a piece coming out in the NYU Environmental Law Review next month called The End Externalities Manifesto. Thanks again for the chance to offer a thought, and congratulations, Marie-Claire.
Thank you very much. May I give the floor to Professor Wayne Garnons-Williams, who is a specialist in intertribal trade and dealing, I assume, with minorities.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. First of all, regional small trade initiatives set new innovative examples for addressing responsible and environmental sustainable trade. Indigenous trade is the blending of thousands of years of grassroots sustainable trade philosophy with modern trade tools. For example, with respect to the SDGs, indigenous trade is closely tied to meeting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And as we all know, often a key success in one will involve tackling issues more commonly associated with other aspects of the UN SDGs. And indigenous trading nations, by their very unique experience, are best suited to help nation states meet these international environmental goals. For example, the indigenous concept of the 7th generation principle applied to industrial development. For example, the indigenous 7th generation principle is when you make a decision as a First Nation, you consider, will it adversely impact the 7th generation from me? A 7th generation I will not know, I will be long dead, but will it adversely impact? If it adversely impacts, don't do it. But you can still have progress, you can still have innovation, you can still have commerce. Another aspect with respect to leading the way is New Zealand and the Maori, or New Zealand Aotearoa, as they call it. They have, the nation state of New Zealand has embraced an awful lot of the Maori philosophy. And you've seen that in the sense that it's been installed into the way that New Zealand governs itself. When we look at the way that the environment is dealt with there, in the sense that there's a synthesis of indigenous traditional knowledge and philosophy blending with New Zealand common law. The examples, of course, are the idea that the land and watershed have its own, certain areas are granted its own title to which to defend itself, and the Maori of that region speak on behalf of the river or speak on behalf of the land for the best interests of the land against the common interest of corporate interest or against whatnot. So that you've got that capacity for a new way of looking at environmental stewardship. And it's blending the old environmental stewardship philosophies with new concepts. And we're seeing that in trade as well in New Zealand with, for example, in 2013, New Zealand signed an indigenous trade agreement with the Republic of Taiwan. Last year in February, New Zealand signed an indigenous trade agreement with Australia. So the last point here is in North America with the United States-Mexico trade agreement and Canada, we've got indigenous trade elements and indigenous environmental stewardship. Back in February of this year, US President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau had a mini summit where they agreed to, quote, build back better together. And part of that was addressing the disproportionate impacts of the environment and indigenous peoples in a new trade world. So what does this mean? It means joint initiatives to accelerate economic recovery of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, with a focus on supporting women-owned, minority-owned, indigenous-owned SMEs, and leveraging the various aspects of USMCA, whether or not it's the SME section, or if it's the environmental section. And finally, the Prime Minister and President agreed to be partners in protecting nature, including supporting Indigenous-led conservation efforts, because Indigenous people live on the land that have the same philosophies as the Maori, in the sense that you live with the land, not above it, not use it as simply as a tool, but you are part of the land and land is part of you. So it's an important aspect that we're seeing from a grassroots sustainable development philosophy, applying the modern tools of trade for innovative ways of moving forward. And I use the example in Canada of there's 150 large-scale clean energy projects with First Nations across Canada, 95 hydro, 83 wind, 12 biomass, 11 solar, and 56 energy conversion. All of this can be used not only as a means to get rid of the fossil fuels industry, but as well to focus on new trades, new opportunities for these First Nations to be able to sell and trade their skills on clean energy projects. So it's those small scale projects that are having an impact in innovating and finding new solutions. I think that's my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think in terms of the governance question, we may go back to the question: Do trees have standing? Are these people, are these interests sufficiently represented in the system? Maybe this is a question we also need to take up. Are there any particular questions from our distinguished experts?
Just to interject, Thomas, I
Yeah.
just wanted to say that here in Orlando, in Central Florida, in the United States, we have just, in one of our grassroots efforts, passed a provision providing that rivers have standing, and we're on next to trees.
Very good. But it's something we're far away from in the international trading system, and it's something perhaps Dan takes up also in his paper he alluded to.
Well, Thomas, your raising of this is a very apropos, because Chris Stone, who was famously the one to raise the question, has just died.
Oh,
so he died just a few weeks ago. So it's an appropriate moment for all of us to reflect on that very powerful article that he drafted nearly half a century ago that pushed this question and told us all that we needed to be the advocates of nature, because at least in some judicial systems, the United States notably, trees would not have standing. And I think it is time to revisit that. And certainly we need to ask that very same question in the context of the underpinnings of the trading regime and the investment regime.
Very good. I think we need to move on. I'm under a very tight schedule, and you also have other things to do later on. But so let's turn to the panel, essentially dealing with the challenges in international investment and financial rules here. How can international investment and financial rules guide and facilitate more sustainable post-pandemic economic recovery? On the panel, we have Advocate Meg Kinner, Secretary General of the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Dispute, ICSID, and we have Advocate Wendy Miles, Queen's Counsel from the International Chamber of Commerce Court of Arbitration. And I'd like to give the floor to the two speakers, and then following up with a comment by Jorge Wallis. Meg, may I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you. Well, speaking from the investment mechanism side, first of all, obviously, I believe that there is an immense need right now to really use this system to support all of the investments that are needed. We know that government and institutions like the World Bank cannot do this all themselves. So it really does put a premium on mobilizing private sector finance. And Wayne noted in particular the role of small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's very key. And all of this is exactly the goal of investment law, investment arbitration, and dispute settlement. It's to promote those flows of private investment by creating strong investment climates and giving investors a situation where they're confident that they will be treated in accordance with the rule of law. In terms of law, I think it's very clear that we have the international law basis to do this in a very constructive way that accommodates and reflects and incorporates SDG goals. You can go back to international law principles of police powers, and James Crawford, who we mentioned before, actually very well noted the way there is a wide swath of discretion for governments to act in the public interest, and that we will give governments broad deference to act in this way as long as they're acting in good faith, in a non-discriminatory manner, and in a way that's proportionate to the objective they are trying to achieve. So you have that legal platform. What we've seen in particular in the last 10 years is that investment treaties have incorporated, and I think gone even farther, updating and reinforcing these principles to try and reflect these priorities. And Marie-Claire noted some of the approaches, but you see a lot of interesting things now in the new generation of treaties. Things like preambles declaring the importance of sustainable development, carve-outs from certain obligations, expropriation measures updated so that non-discriminatory measures for legitimate public welfare objectives will not be considered expropriation, the development of corporate social responsibility, requirements to comply with whole state laws, including on environment, denial of benefits clauses. There are a lot of new techniques that are incorporated in the new generation of treaties that I think are really going to help us move forward with this, with these developments. The other thing we see in the cases is that tribunals and parties are dealing with these more frequently. So just to give you two examples, we see counterclaims for environmental harm that have been successful in several new cases. And we are actually seeing investment cases brought to enforce the environmental obligations of the state. So we are seeing a whole new use of investment dispute settlement to reaffirm the values. Finally, I think something I'm certain Wendy will certainly emphasize in the commercial context, you have here a very effective dispute resolution tool, one that importantly cross borders, both in its implementation and in enforcement. It allows experts, expert tribunal members, public interest participation, non-disputing states. So I think it's really a good tool that can complement all of these efforts. Just two little things I wanted to say on the challenges. Number one is that as we move forward in all of this, I think it's important to keep a very clear, disciplined focus on taking action based on a sound scientific record for legitimate purposes and in a fair way. And we've got to be very clear-eyed about that. And lastly, I think it's really important to start thinking even more about innovations that will facilitate investment, especially in things like sustainable technologies. We've seen a lot of important work at the WTO now on trade facilitation, and some of that obviously will roll over into investment facilitation. But I think it would be very interesting to start see an agenda of investment facilitation that would support all of these SDGs and their accomplishments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I turn the floor to Wendy Miles?
Thank you, Professor Cochier, and thank you, Meg, for that segue. So I'm going to pick that up and take you just a little bit further into the layers of the government systems or the governance of institutions. So the multi-level governance, I think it comes in relation to actors. I think it also comes in relation to instruments. So I just want to say a few words about that. But before I do, Wayne, who's always so wonderful to speak to, was talking about the going back to Indigenous people's rights. And I just want to come back to the book and Marie-Claire's, as ever, wonderful, wonderful lecture. And she talks about reimagining sustainable trade and development. But Wayne actually characterized it more as remembering or recalling sustainable trade and development. What we used to do, we don't have to reinvent it. We can actually learn a lot from our history as ever. But if Marie-Claire, if you could just hold up your book, if you don't mind, because it's Athena's treaty. So it dives right back. Although she reimagines, she very much does reimagine using history, using background. And I think that's rather beautiful. And I think that's all about what sustainability is. And Wayne also mentioned 7 generations. I'm sure it's less than that now because a life is much longer. So that 7 generation is probably only 3 to get to the same temporal period. But what I was going to talk about was the actors and the instruments in this multiple levels of governance. And we're focused, because this is the focus of the lecture, on the international instruments for sustainable development and trade. But underneath, which are of course the instruments entered into between states, by states, enforceable against states, by states, and occasionally with the bilateral, multilateral investment treaties enforceable by private actors as investors. But they sit at the top layer, and underneath that, of course, we have entire national law systems and commercial law systems that govern trade, investment, and commerce. And then underneath that, we have entire contractual systems where parties enter into their own individual governing law instruments, their individual contracts. And all of those can be reimagined or recalled or remembered with along the same theme. It doesn't have to begin and end just with those international trade law instruments. And in many ways, those lower down instruments, the national legislative regulatory environment, the national policy and how they invest, and also the individual contracts brokered by private parties investing or by governments accepting investments, can all actually bring change much, much, much more quickly. And the consistency so often is this enforcement through international arbitration, which is outside individual national courts, which can be so very, very powerful. So I just wanted to mention in relation to mobilizing private sector finance, which is what Meg mentioned, so much of getting to a reset, sustainable international trade system relies on private finance. So it can't just be for states to set the rules as between themselves. It must come down. But I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is the relationship in commerce between states and private parties. So leave aside the investment agreements for one moment, and let's just focus on one aspect of those contracts, public procurement contracts. Now, $90 trillion GDP in 2018, 11 trillion of that was subject to public procurement. That's 12% of global GDP is subject to a contract, a commercial contract between a state and a private party. So those governments, those individual states, both individually, collectively as a region, but collectively globally, have enormous agency, not just to govern the behavior of one another and private sector, but themselves, their own conduct, how they enter into their contracts and what provisions they provide in those. So all of these sustainable SDG goal-driven aspects that Marie-Claire talks about in investment treaties can also be pushed down at minimum into those government contracts. And then the last thing I wanted to say was in relation to the question on carbon constrained sort of recovery, right? The beauty and the opportunity of where we are with the terrible, terrible situation with the climate is it's imperative that we reset how we invest, and it's happening. We are in transition, it's happening, we are doing it. So as we build back better, as we reset post-COVID, private investors are working in a different way, and governments have to work in a different way too in those contracts. It's already happening. And I know people talked about recognizing the life of trees in the broader sort of human rights context. But you know what? Those private contracts are recognizing the capacity of trees to breathe in that carbon, and we are giving value to trees through offsets, through nature-based solutions, through voluntary carbon markets in a way that's never been seen before. And that is scaling up like crazy. So there's all sorts of ways, including through all sorts of commercial law instruments, private and public, that this can be accelerated with that multi-level governance in mind, multi-level actors, multi-level instruments. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to recall that the Government Procurement Agreement in the WTO, when it was revised, was actually the first one when green procurement was being introduced, and I hope it is gradually trickling down here. I'd like to give the floor to Professor Jorge Wallis, who's heading the Energy and Natural Resources Governance Institute at University of Cambridge for additional thoughts on the topic.
Thanks, Thomas. Just very, very quickly, my basic point is that, well, I of course agree with Meg and Wendy have been presenting. I guess that we have to be very clear about one thing, one very simple point that is the most complex equation to solve, is the fact that we need to at the same time make space for what we call green deals and what used to be called industrial policy, but it's now green industrial policy. And that's one part of it. And we can modify some of the agreements, but many of the agreements will stay the way they are now. And the other thing, which is very important, is that even if we modify these agreements to make space, that may harm also the green industry. So you see that it's modifying, making space for more regulatory change within the system, also opens up regulatory space for states to actually take measures that do not benefit the green industry. We're seeing a lot these days, green industries actually struggling with each other or fighting with each other using the old investment tools. And this is only natural. This is only natural because once the transition is over, you no longer need them to fight the brown economy. You can use them, you need them to keep your situation. So usually, I mean, I would have gone much more into details, but I think that we need to strike that balance. And how is that balance going to be struck? Well, you have two options. One is using what we have. There is no choice there because treaties are not going to disappear. So the only option that you have is interpretation. And interpretation requires a mindset change. I've been saying it for over a decade, so I'm not going to elaborate on that much, but I think we need a mindset change, and I see that the mindset change is here. So it's very clearly here, and you see it in the decisions. The other way to do it is to bring in new clauses. The problem of new clauses is they are not ripe yet. We have plenty of them, but they're not tested in the case. I have 3 cases only that I can think of where they have been tested and the results are unclear. And we need to elaborate upon the ways in which we frame them, because otherwise we will be either closing or opening. And just to give you the typical example that I give in these type of occasions, you can read one of those non-precluded measures clause for environmental protection either as a tax carve-out in Article 21 of the ECT, which would preclude jurisdiction immediately of the tribunal, or you can read it as an exception clause, which would suppose that there is a breach in the first place, much like you have in Article 20 of the GATT. Now, the space that you give there is completely different. Now, if you open up, if you really open up for green, you would give it the first framing. If you want to close the space for green, which may be good also for green later, you would give it the perspective of Article 20. But I'll stop there. It's just the typical thoughts that you would hear from me in these occasions.
Thank you very much. I think it was very important to draw attention to interpretation, also following up what James said. I think it's been the main contribution of the appellate body of the first generation to constitutionalize public international law in the sense that we have a more sophisticated system to balance different interests today. And I think that probably also translates what I learned just now in the field of investment protection here. So I'm optimistic that the old instruments can be properly used with recognizing purposes expressed in the SDGs, I suppose. Any questions to our panelists from the distinguished experts? No particular question? Okay, so I think I would like to conclude then the panel session, and I'd like to open up just for general questions from the audience, and I may ask our Zoom moderators, Blessing and Freedom K, to perhaps put 1 or 2 questions to our panelists here.
Thank you, Thomas. There's 2 questions that both refer to sustainable consumption and production, so SDG 12. The first comes from Dr. Freya Lesnewaska from University of London, who asks, how would the WTO rules need to change to facilitate inclusive circular economy? Well, Jennifer Mbab from the European Law School asks what opportunities exist to implement sustainable consumption and production patterns in WTO member states without infringing obligations under investment agreements, particularly against the backdrop of many economically disenfranchised states that simply cannot afford disputes with interveners. How could the WTO help to work to ensure sustainability requirements are integrated to admit largest existing communities or to address existing commitments?
Who would like to take the question? Any comments on the circular economy? I think which has a very interesting component in services. because people who are repairing things and providing services to keep goods going.
I think Marcus Gehring is online and is working on some of those issues.
Marcus, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, very happy to, and thank you for wonderful interventions and such an inspiring lecture. I think Marie-Claire referred to what the objectives should be when we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and I would echo her thesis that if a state genuinely implements the Sustainable Development Goals, also in terms of production patterns and the circular economy, there's very little in terms of that would give immediate World Trade Organization or WTO law concerns, I would argue, especially in the light of the fact that these goals are internationally agreed. Another innovative solution, just spearheaded by Switzerland under the Wto Agreement, is of course the issue of tariff differentiation. So you can bilaterally agree that the more sustainable product should be traded at a much more favorable tariff rate than the less sustainable product. And I think it's those kind of innovations that we need to pay much more attention to. Of course, the debate at the moment is very much on climate change, because a good that is produced in a carbon intensive way is indistinguishable from a good that is produced in a low carbon way. And how do we deal with that difference is going to be a huge challenge. The European Union will propose in July the CBAM, the border carbon mechanism, and we will see how other WTO partners will react to that.
Thank you very much. I think you draw the attention to the PPM question, which is absolutely central, but which would take another 2 hours to explore, I suppose. But we can keep that in mind. The second question, Prem, could you repeat briefly?
No problem. The second question focused specifically on the opportunities to implement sustainable consumption production patterns in WTO member states without infringing on obligations under investment treaties. So I think the concern is speaking to changes of the investment or shifting of the legal circumstances following an investment. So how would the member state be able to implement a green approach without infringing on their investor state obligations?
That's a field which is not essentially addressed by the WTO and falls outside.
Yeah.
Marie-Claire, would you like to take that question?
I'll make one brief comment, but then I would happily turn toward Ilaria or Meg or Wendy or other experts online. This is the kind of question that Jorge would have absolutely loved, and he had to slip away. But I think it is quite important to look at some of those cases that Meg referred to. Investment law, investment arbitration is a sword and a shield, and it can be used just as much by a solar power company who's worried that a country is suddenly withdrawing its feed-in tariffs and leaving their investment vulnerable, as it could be used by a coal-fired power plant that is worried that they'll lose the value of their investment. I think we do have to be willing to be open-minded in our definition of which investments are in like circumstances, but we should not miss that those large actors that Ricardo mentioned can play perfectly well sometimes without those assurances. It's the smaller companies, the ones who are worried that they will lose their shirts, the ones that maybe are trying, as we wrote about in the book, to make investments in some of those other new technologies that our multilateral treaties like the Paris Agreement are crying out for. Those smaller actors often also need the shield of the investment arbitration to feel comfortable that their investments are going to be treated in a way that is fair. And this is doubly or triply true when it's a south-south-south-north investment. And we're seeing that more and more. I want to give Meg and Wendy a chance to jump in. They're even better placed on this.
Please.
I was just going to say to look at the Energy Charter Treaty Secretariat statistics, because they demonstrate, as does the book, exactly what Marie-Claire's saying right now, is that, you know, it's the vast majority of investor claimants under the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, are small, medium enterprises or individuals. Very, very few large players, very, very few large investment funds. That's number one. And then number two, the subject matter. The subject matter under the Energy Charter Treaty, almost all cases right now, but the vast majority of cases in the statistics overall deal with renewables. So it's protecting investment in renewables. Now you need to protect the right sort of investment made in the right sort of way, but we also just need to protect investment. And that's what Meg was talking about with, we have to mobilize an enormous amount of private capital. So you need to give comfort, you need to give securitization to mobilize that capital.
And maybe I'd just add that as this debate goes on, the whole question about what are legitimate expectations is really moving very quickly. And the question of changing circumstances includes changes because we have these burning problems that we have to solve globally.
Thank you. I think we take two more questions and then we have to come to a close. Time is up, and I think we should respect that Zoom meetings shouldn't go beyond 120 minutes.
Thomas, could I just follow up very quickly
on
something that Marcus said? Yeah, just on the question of carbon. So that was a very interesting and provocative statement by Marcus, and we need to follow up this up, and we will all as the European Union comes out with the CBAM. But I wanted to just sort of broaden that and say that what we really need is a system where the incentives to protect rainforests, so to speak, work in tandem with policies to resolve the needs that cause the communities to turn those forests into charcoal. And what I mean is that there's a very fine balance that needs to be found in designing this type of policies. Now, that leads me to something else on the differentiation of products, which is the use of labeling that serves as an incentive. And so, as you know, there's been evolution in the interpretation, as you said, and following Jorge Viñuela's statement before as well, which I think, I strongly believe, and I checked with Jim Backus, and I think Jim would be in agreement with me, would allow for the use of, again, labeling that, for instance, contains information on the carbon embedded in products, and in a way that differentiates the products, even giving competitive advantage to some products over others, even if they are substitutable and directly competing goods. And so, again, through interpretation of WTO law, I think we have gotten there. This is the beauty of evolutionary law. And I think that those things should be explored more.
Adding to that, as I read the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, I believe Ricardo's right. Clearly, labeling requirements are permitted, and I'm of the view in reading that definition that would include eco-labeling of the kind you described.
No, I think we
Sorry, I don't know what happened to my voice.
Yeah. No, I think we came a long way. The problem is to what extent can it be practically applied to complex products with a long value chain here. That's just a practical question. And certainly it works for simple products and commodities, but the complex ones are a challenge here. And probably there one needs more harmonization. Okay.
I think it's right. You need more standards, you need better metrics, you need agreement on both.
Yeah.
I think Blessing has the last questions for you, Thomas.
Okay. Blessing?
Okay, so the next question, this is from Dr. Johanna Lorenzo from the Berlin Potsdam Research Group in Germany. One of the targets under SDG 10 on reducing inequalities pertains to the implementation of the principle of special and differential treatment for developing countries. So the question is, can the new generation regional trade and investment agreements offer better prospects for operationalizing this principle of special and differential treatment? What type of provisions in trade and investment treaties could be more effective in ensuring that participation in the multilateral rules-based trading system is more inclusive? And the second question, which comes from Wei Liang from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in the US, goes how the provisions of the CPTPP, so the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements stand up in the areas of climate change and sustainability. So what provisions in these two agreements, particularly highlight the areas of climate change and sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to address the S&D question? Very interesting.
I just published a book on this from Routledge, along with my co-author, Inu Manik. And we propose some very specific reforms of special and differential treatment there. We don't see the problems in SDT that, say, Donald Trump saw. There's no evidence that it's harming developed countries, but in our view, in many ways, it's harmed developing countries because the ways in which it's been applied have provided barriers and simple excuses for not bringing them more fully into the trading system. Of course, this also relates to an issue that Ricardo raised earlier about making certain in agriculture, textiles, and other sectors in which developing countries have a comparative advantage, that they have the benefit of it in terms of their market access to developed country markets. On the issue of the provisions in the CPTPP and the RCEP as relates to climate change, there's some good sustainable development provisions in what was originally the TPP. I'm not much impressed by what's in the RCEP on much of anything. For example, in digital trade, there is a retreat from what's in the CPTPP. But you can pick and choose different provisions in those agreements and all the others that Marie-Claire mentioned, on which we can build going forward. There's not nearly enough in any existing agreement on climate change. There are some good things, I think, in the CETA between Canada and the European Union. And in fact, I think that's one of the best regional trade agreements that's been negotiated, and look forward to it coming fully into force.
Thank you.
So maybe a little quick addition to the SDT question, Thomas, if I may.
Yep.
So on the SDT, again, I hate saying we have been writing about this and talking about this, but about 20 years ago, a large group of people were behind this idea that we were promoting then, which is about a redesign of SDT, such that it's not time that really sort of assumes that countries are going to be ready in terms of assuming their obligations in WTO agreements, rather a set of other metrics, right? So a basket of sustainability or sustainable development metrics, including, we were suggesting at that time, use Human Development Index or something like this for a number of those provisions. It's not because you give a country 5 or 10 or 15 years to adapt or to just assume that it's going to adapt, that it's going to happen. And that's one thing. But the second thing is, again, is really redirecting the trade system to respond to other values than efficiency and commercial sort of relations.
As you know, Ricardo, that's precisely what we propose in our new book. I believe we
good.
Are you I wonder, are you also picking up on the idea which we developed at the time on graduation, that we would use more economic indicators and factors to have certain rules kick in, which may be in the agreements?
And so I think that the idea, again, that the idea of graduation was is one that if you think from a sustainable development perspective, again, you have to really inform with other type of criteria, right, than what has been discussed in the past. And that's really the innovation. But is it really a question, and I leave this to you, who are the legal scholars here, but is it really a question of interpretation to move towards that type of solution? Or is it about reinventing rules and probably incorporating them in the bottom-up approach
it's
to the
not
evolution
a
of law?
question of interpretation, because the notion of special and differential treatment is nowhere defined in the covered agreements. It lies in the eyes of the builders.
Yeah.
Right.
And if I can add one extra point, which is that we can look beyond the trade and investment regimes at a certain moment, and we can look toward some of the other treaties, including the Paris Agreement itself, and the broader collaboration structures that are forming around the UNFCCC, but also, for example, this new agreement on trade and climate change and sustainability. And we can say, well, what other innovative provisions can we put forth that not just encourage countries to develop in certain areas, but actually challenge them to go a great deal further in a new economy? And I'm not going to elaborate here, but I think that's going to be the next book, is to look at the trade and investment measures that are being adopted in the other sustainable development treaties and how we can use them. I always get in trouble from colleagues for asking my environmental law colleagues, please not to help us with drafting the carbon tax. I need really good tax lawyers who are going to be able to make it work for its climate change objective. And that includes not just what in the climate regime might have been called a mirror principle or a related principle, common but differentiated responsibilities with respect to capacities, but it goes further than that, and it says, what kind of mechanisms can we set up if we accept from the start that we are actually in very different circumstances, and that's got to be addressed to get success in what is a global problem. Anyway, I'll hold myself there.
That was a wonderful closing statement, except I need to check with Blessing whether we responded to the second question.
Blessing, you're muted.
Oh, yes. Yes, so the second question was examples of provisions from the CPTPP that.
I think, okay.
Yes,
James,
so yes,
I think
yes,
James addressed that, okay.
Yes.
So I think that then it was a wonderful final closing remark, and I would like to close the meeting with Mary Claire's statement, and on behalf of all of us, thank and acknowledge the support of the Leverhulme Trust, which make these lectures possible, and to recognize the co-hosting of the University of East Anglia and Oxford University Press, and the partner institutions, the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, Center for International Sustainable Development Law, Center of Energy, Environment and Natural Resources Governance, Center for Climate Change Engagements, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Global Sustainable Institute, International Law Association, and Cambridge Zero Policy Forum here. I also would like to thank very much the team who arranged for this wonderful evening and conversation under the leadership of Mary Claire. And it's really another testament of her ability not only to link the dots in the different fields of law, but also to link the dots between a great many people who are here either on screen or listening to us. And for those who were not able to follow or had to leave, I'd like to recall that the recording of this session will be shared with all those who registered for the meeting here. And I hope it will, together with the new book, which we celebrated this evening here, fully support you in all your ventures and your work. And certainly what I'm always been inspired by Mary Claire is her optimism and her energy to move forward in sometimes rather difficult times. So with this, I really would like to conclude the meeting. I'd like to give it back to Freedom, who started this off, and say good morning, good afternoon, and good night to wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, and good evening.
Thank you very much.